What happens when royalty meets reality television, and one of the most beloved hosts in Britain is forced to stand his ground against an entitled guest who thinks he's above the rules? In just 36 seconds, a single comment would shatter the illusion of a friendly chat and turn a simple interview into one of the most shocking exits in talk show history. This is the story of the night Jonathan Ross had to do what no one ever thought he would: kick a member of the royal family off his own show. The Friday night audience at Television Center was buzzing with anticipation. Jonathan Ross, the quick-witted host known for his charm and ability to make anyone feel comfortable, was about to sit down with Prince Harry, the guest everyone wanted to see, the royal everyone thought they knew. The show started like any other. Bright lights, applause, Jonathan's signature entrance. He walked onto the stage with that familiar smile, waving to the crowd, soaking in the energy. He'd interviewed hundreds of celebrities, movie stars, musicians, politicians. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had royalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan began, his voice warm and welcoming, "please give it up for Prince Harry." The audience erupted. Cameras flashed. Harry walked out, a slight smirk on his face, waving to the crowd with an air of casual confidence that bordered on arrogance. He sat down across from Jonathan, adjusting his jacket, looking around the studio as if he owned the place. "Welcome. Welcome," Jonathan said, extending his hand for a shake. "Great to have you here." Harry took his hand, gave it a brief shake, then leaned back in his chair like he was settling into his living room. "Good to be here, Jonathan," he said, though his tone suggested he could think of a dozen other places he'd rather be. The first few minutes were fine. Standard talk show fare. Jonathan asked about Harry's recent charity work, his travels, his life in the public eye. Harry answered, but with this edge to his voice. Every response felt loaded, like he was doing Jonathan a favor just by being there. "So," Jonathan said, keeping things light, "you've been involved with quite a few charitable organizations. What drives that passion?" Harry shrugged. "Well, when you're born into the position I was, you have responsibilities. Some of us take them seriously, others just coast." The audience laughed nervously. Was that a dig at someone? Jonathan's smile tightened, just a fraction, but he pushed forward. Right, Jonathan nodded. "And you've traveled extensively for these causes. Any memorable moments?" "Plenty," Harry said, crossing his legs. "Though I have to say, most of the events are rather predictable. You show up, people fawn over you, you shake some hands, smile for photos. It's all a bit rehearsed, isn't it?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Well, I suppose when you're doing good work, the routine is worth it, yeah?" "Sure," Harry said dismissively, "if you need that validation." There was an uncomfortable pause. The audience wasn't sure whether to laugh or cringe. Jonathan, ever the professional, pivoted to another topic. "Let's talk about your time in the military," Jonathan said. "That's something you've spoken about with real pride." "It was the only time I felt normal," Harry said. "The only time people treated me like everyone else. Not like some performing monkey." The words hung in the air. Jonathan's expression shifted slightly. Was Harry calling himself a performing monkey, or was this aimed at something else? "I can imagine that must have been refreshing," Jonathan offered carefully. "You can imagine?" Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jonathan, with all due respect, you can't imagine what it's like. You're a talk show host. You sit here every week, asking scripted questions, laughing at your own jokes. I've actually lived a life." The audience gasped. The tension in the room went from uncomfortable to hostile in seconds. Jonathan's face remained composed, but his jaw tightened. He'd been insulted on his own show before, usually in jest, but this was different. This was deliberate. "Well," Jonathan said slowly, his voice still calm, "I'd argue that every life has value, Harry. Whether you're in the military, hosting a show, or working at a supermarket. We all have our roles. Harry scoffed. That's a very diplomatic answer. Very safe. But let's be honest, Jonathan. Some roles matter more than others. Some people are born to lead. Others are born to entertain. The audience was dead silent now. You could hear the cameras adjusting, the crew members shifting in the background. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on Harry. "So which one am I, then?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Am I here to entertain you?" Harry smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Well, that is your job, isn't it? To entertain, to make people laugh, to keep things light and fluffy so no one has to think too hard." "And what's your job, Harry?" Jonathan shot back, his tone sharpening. "To sit there and talk down to people who've worked their entire lives to get where they are? To belittle the very platform you agreed to come on?" Harry's smile faded. "Careful, Jonathan. You're talking to a prince. And you're talking to a host who won't be disrespected on his own show," Jonathan replied, his voice firm now. "I don't care what title you have. You don't get to come here and insult me, insult this show, and insult everyone who works here." The audience started to applaud. Quiet at first, then louder. Harry looked around, clearly surprised by the support Jonathan was getting. He sat up straighter, his face reddening. "Oh, please," Harry said, waving a hand dismissively. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people are so sensitive. I make one honest observation, and suddenly I'm the villain." "Honest observation?" Jonathan repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You called me and my work meaningless. You suggested that what I do, what my team does, doesn't matter. That's not honesty, Harry. That's arrogance." Harry stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and be lectured by you." "Then don't," Jonathan said, standing up as well. "You're welcome to leave." The audience was on the edge of their seats. This was uncharted territory. No one had ever walked out of Jonathan's show. And no one had ever been told to leave. Harry stared at Jonathan, his eyes narrowing. "You're really going to do this? You're going to kick me off your little show?" "I'm giving you the choice," Jonathan said calmly. "You can sit back down, we can have a respectful conversation, and we can finish this interview like adults. Or you can continue with this attitude. And yes, I'll ask you to leave." For a moment, it looked like Harry might actually sit back down. His hand hovered over the arm of the chair, but then he straightened up, pulled at his jacket, and shook his head. "You know what, Jonathan? You're not worth my time," Harry said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This show, this audience, none of it matters. I came here as a favor, and this is how you treat me." Jonathan crossed his arms. "A favor? Harry, you're a guest. Just like everyone else who sits in that chair. And every single one of them has shown more grace and humility than you've shown tonight." Harry's face went red. "How dare you compare me to your usual guests? I am not some actor promoting a film or some musician hawking an album. I'm a member of the royal family." "And I'm asking you to leave," Jonathan said, his voice final. The studio went completely silent. Harry stared at Jonathan, clearly waiting for him to back down, to apologize, to beg him to stay. But Jonathan didn't move. He just stood there, arms crossed, face set. "Fine," Harry spat. "I'm done here anyway." He turned and started walking off the set. The cameras followed him, capturing every step. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the audience, didn't say another word. He just walked straight through the backstage door, leaving Jonathan standing alone on the stage. The audience didn't know what to do. Should they applaud? Should they sit in stunned silence? Then one person started clapping, then another. Then the entire studio erupted into applause, a standing ovation for Jonathan, who had just done what seemed impossible. Jonathan raised a hand, acknowledging the support, but his expression was serious. He walked back to his chair, sat down, and took a deep breath. The cameras were still rolling. The show had to go on. "Well," Jonathan said, running a hand through his hair, "that was unexpected." The audience laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "I want to say something," Jonathan continued, his voice thoughtful. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've had incredible conversations with incredible people, and I've always believed that respect goes both ways. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, or what title you hold. If you can't treat people with basic decency, then you don't belong in that chair." More applause. Jonathan smiled, a genuine smile this time. "I didn't want it to end that way," he admitted. "I was looking forward to a great conversation. But I won't compromise the integrity of this show, or the people who make it happen, for anyone." The audience roared their approval. Jonathan stood up, thanked them, and the show cut to commercial. Behind the scenes, the crew was in shock. Producers were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of the show. But Jonathan was calm. He knew he'd made the right call. When the show came back from commercial, Jonathan had a replacement guest lined up, a comedian who happened to be backstage. They had a great conversation, full of laughs and genuine warmth. It was a reminder of what the show was supposed to be. A place for real connection, real conversation, not a platform for ego and entitlement. But everyone knew that the moment that would be remembered, the moment that would be talked about for years, was when Jonathan Ross stood up to a prince and won. When he proved that no title, no status, no amount of privilege could excuse bad behavior. The audience that night witnessed something rare. They saw a host defend his craft, his team, and his values. They saw someone refuse to be walked over, even when the person doing the walking was royalty. And Harry? He walked out of that studio thinking he'd made a point, thinking he'd shown everyone that he was above it all. But what he'd really shown was that respect isn't given because of a title. It's earned through actions. And that night, he lost it completely. Jonathan, on the other hand, earned something far more valuable. He earned the respect of everyone watching. He showed that dignity and professionalism aren't about saying yes to everyone. They're about knowing when to say no, when to draw a line, when to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The conversation started so simply. Standard questions, standard answers. But with each exchange, the cracks began to show. Harry's dismissive tone, his condescending remarks, his complete lack of regard for the people around him. It built slowly, like pressure in a kettle, until it finally boiled over. "You're a talk show host. You sit here every week, asking scripted questions, laughing at your own jokes. I've actually lived a life." That was the line that changed everything. The moment Harry revealed his true feelings. Not just about Jonathan, but about everyone he considered beneath him. And Jonathan, to his credit, didn't explode. He didn't yell or insult Harry back. He simply asked Harry to show respect or leave. That choice, that simple ultimatum, was what made Jonathan the hero of the story. Because he didn't need to humiliate Harry. He didn't need to tear him down. He just needed to set a boundary and enforce it. And when Harry chose to leave rather than respect that boundary, he sealed his own fate. The walk-off was almost surreal. Harry, so confident moments before, now storming off like a child who didn't get his way. The cameras capturing every second of his retreat. The audience, initially shocked, now rallying behind Jonathan. It was a complete reversal. Harry came in thinking he was untouchable and left exposed as someone who couldn't handle being treated like everyone else. Jonathan's speech after Harry left was perfect. No gloating, no anger. Just a simple statement about respect and integrity. It was the kind of moment that defines a career. The kind of moment that shows who someone really is when the pressure is on. Because here's the thing, Jonathan could have let it slide. He could have laughed off Harry's insults, made a joke, moved on. That's what most hosts would have done. Keep the show moving. Don't make waves. Don't risk offending royalty. But Jonathan didn't do that. He stood his ground. He demanded respect. And when he didn't get it, he ended the interview. That takes courage. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from a title or a position. The kind that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. The audience understood that. They felt it. That's why they stood and applauded. That's why the moment resonated so deeply. Because everyone has been in a situation where someone treated them poorly, talked down to them, made them feel small. And most of the time, we let it happen. We smile, we nod, we move on. But Jonathan didn't. He showed everyone watching that it's okay to stand up for yourself. It's okay to say enough. And the beauty of it was how he did it. Calm, composed, dignified. He didn't match Harry's aggression with his own. He didn't sink to that level. He stayed professional while still being firm. That's the mark of someone who truly understands respect. It's not about power. It's not about who can shout the loudest. It's about maintaining your principles even when it's difficult. Harry's final words before leaving were telling. You're not worth my time. This show, this audience, none of it matters. I came here as a favor. A favor. As if gracing the show with his presence was some grand gesture. As if Jonathan and his team should be grateful just to be in his orbit. That kind of thinking, that level of entitlement, is exactly what made the moment so powerful. Because Jonathan's response was clear. No one is doing anyone a favor here. This is a conversation between equals. And if you can't see that, then this conversation is over. The replacement guest who came on after was a reminder of what great interviews look like. Two people talking, laughing, sharing stories, mutual respect, genuine interest, real connection. Everything the Harry interview wasn't. And the contrast was striking. It showed the audience exactly what they'd been missing, while Harry was busy being condescending. But even with the great conversation that followed, even with the laughs and the applause, everyone knew that the Harry moment was what would define that episode. That night, that moment when a talk show host looked a prince in the eye and said, "Not on my show." Jonathan later sat back in his chair, the weight of what had happened settling in. He'd just kicked royalty off his show. In another era, that might have been unthinkable. Career suicide. A scandal that would follow him forever. But in that studio, in that moment, it felt like the only thing he could do. The right thing. The necessary thing. Because at the end of the day, the show isn't about the guests. It's about the conversation. It's about respect, authenticity, and treating people like human beings. Harry forgot that. He thought his title gave him a pass to be rude, dismissive, superior. He thought Jonathan would just take it because that's what everyone else did. But Jonathan proved him wrong, and in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that respect is a two-way street. That no matter who you are, you don't get to treat people poorly and expect them to smile and take it. That dignity matters. That standing up for yourself matters. That knowing your worth matters. The cameras captured it all. Every word, every expression, every moment of tension. And when Harry walked off that stage, when Jonathan stood there receiving a standing ovation from an audience that had his back, it became clear who had really won. Not the person with the title, not the person with the famous name, but the person with the integrity to say, "This isn't okay, and I won't accept it." That's the story of the night Prince Harry got kicked off Jonathan Ross's show. Not because Jonathan wanted drama, not because he was looking for attention, but because when faced with disrespect, he chose dignity, When faced with entitlement, he chose equality. When faced with someone who thought they were above the rules, he proved that on his show, everyone plays by the same ones, and that's a lesson worth remembering. In a world where titles and status often shield people from consequences, where the rich and famous get away with behavior that would be unacceptable from anyone else, Jonathan Ross drew a line. He said, "Not here, not on my watch, not in this chair." Harry walked in thinking he was untouchable. He walked out proven very, very wrong. And Jonathan, he walked away with his head held high, knowing he'd done exactly what he needed to do, what any good host would do, what any person with self-respect would do. He stood his ground. And in doing so, he won something far more valuable than a good interview. He won the respect of everyone who saw it. Everyone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is say no. Even to a prince. Especially to a prince who's forgotten that respect isn't about titles. It's about how you treat people. That's the real story. Not the spectacle of a royal walking off a set, but the quiet power of a man who knew his worth and refused to compromise it. Who showed that true strength isn't about asserting dominance. It's about maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect. Who proved that the best way to win an argument isn't to shout the loudest. It's to stand firm in your principles and let the other person's actions speak for themselves. And Harry's actions spoke volumes. They said, "I think I'm better than you. I think I'm above this. I think I can treat you however I want, and you'll just accept it." But Jonathan's actions said something different. They said, "You're wrong, and you can leave." Simple as that. No drama beyond what was necessary. No grand speeches about why Harry was wrong. Just a clear boundary and the willingness to enforce it. That's leadership. That's integrity. That's what makes a moment like this memorable, not because of the conflict, but because of how it was handled. The show went on. Life went on. But that moment, that 36 seconds when everything shifted, when Harry made one comment too many, and Jonathan decided enough was enough, that moment became legendary. A reminder that respect is non-negotiable, that dignity matters, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up and say, "This conversation is over." And Jonathan Ross did exactly that. Not with anger, not with malice, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows their worth and won't let anyone diminish it, not even a prince. That's the story. That's what happened. That's why that night will be remembered long after the jokes are forgotten, long after the other interviews fade away. Because it was real. It was raw. And it showed everyone watching that no matter who you are, if you can't show respect, you don't deserve a seat at the table. Even if that table is on one of the biggest talk shows in Britain. Even if you're royalty. Especially if you're royalty who's forgotten that crowns don't excuse bad behavior. Jonathan Ross reminded us all of that, and we're better for it.